Are you searching for fulfillment? Discover true happiness. Stay tuned to Shalom World.
Do you ever give in to temptation? Have you ever done something then immediately felt regret? Do you have unwanted sexual behaviours in your life? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, you're not alone.
Morality was wrong, so I lived this life.
I thought you shouldn't go.
My name is Paul Ninnis, and I want to welcome you to this series of Real Men. In this episode, we're speaking about desires, triggers, and temptations. Triggers can take us places that we don't want to go, but they can also teach us things. Our temptations can teach us things about what's going on a deeper level. Desire is really good and godly, but disordered desire can quickly lead us into places that are unhealthy for us and unhealthy for others. It's key for any man to know that there are three key areas in their life for desire, trigger, and temptation. The first one is the battlefield of the eyes. The second one is the battlefield of the mind. And the third one, the battlefield of the heart.
Temptations for me are definitely beaches, malls, massive temptations. So I'll call or text my mates, or I'd make sure I don't go on my own. At this current stage in my life, I don't go on my own.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Paul that just being in that open space where women dress so with such tight clothing, they're certainly my triggers.
Yeah, for me it'd just be spending too much time alone, too much time by myself. Beaches as well would be a trigger, especially surfing in the surf, just not paddling out behind girls, and those would be my triggers.
I can honestly say that there's a long list of triggers and things that tempt me, but for me it's what comes after that, letting my mind continue with the fantasy, the thought. Could start with something really innocent and simple, and half an hour later I realise, where are my thoughts right now? Where am I? I'm daydreaming. For me it's a big mental game.
Yeah. So it's like closing the door on that temptation immediately.
I got to just be really vigilant.
Okay, what I do is set up guardrails. So before I put myself in those situations, I make sure I have a mental plan of what I should do before I go there.
Yeah, so my triggers, what was it? Is, so when I'm just doing paperwork on the computer, even looking, like reading news and things, different pop-ups and things come up, social media, beaches, there's a whole list.
I think we've all got a list.
Yeah.
As men, we need to know our particular temptations and the triggers that trigger us into unhealthy sexual pathways. We need to basically know the battleground. We need to know what the enemy's up to. We need to come up with a plan, and we need to choose our weapons wisely. We need to be able to name them to tame them. When we see a trigger that we know is unhelpful for us, that might spur us or steer us along that distorted pathway, we need to recognize it straight away. For a lot of men, it helps to spend some time reflecting on this, to journal about it, to discuss with other men about their particular triggers and their particular temptations. It's different for every man, and we can't just pray them away. We have to come up with a battle plan. Dr. Kevin Skinner, who's an expert in habits and addiction of a sexual nature, he says that as soon as the sort of sequence of temptation starts to happen, we're in big trouble, and that's where a lot of men fall. As soon as we start to have the neurochemical release inside our body and we experience a high, that's when we're in trouble. So by knowing the temptations, by knowing the things that trigger you, we can do a U-turn and we can take an off-ramp before we start to get in trouble.
I think men are tempted, probably particularly when they're alone or when they're having a bad day or they're feeling depressed, because pornography promises them a comfort, it promises them a happiness, and it's just always there and it's so available. I think that it is they're always got. It's not like a drugs where they have to go and buy the drugs to get them. It's always there, always readily available. And so I imagine it would be an incredibly difficult temptation to resist.
When men had more support, when the world, when the society was more Christian, of course there was a lot of suppressed sexualisation going on as well. So we can't deny that. But we did have a world where there was more accountability, whereas now we have nothing. In fact, we're encouraged not to be that way and just to, let it be free. I would think that it would be very, very difficult for a man to control that. There's a smorgasbord of sexual toys in front of you in this world, but don't use it. Even though you've got a real appetite, you've got a great appetite for it, don't use it. And I think that's very difficult for people, and I understand the struggle.
What brings men unstuck?
If I had to bring it down to one word, isolation. I see men that are in isolation and they're not in relationship with God or others, and they end up having a self-centered experience in this world, and then they reach outside of themselves to try and soothe what's happening inside of themselves, and that would be something that, if I had to stick with one word, that would be it.
Great.
Yeah, if I would say one thing, it's what men see, what we look at. Men are very visual. We're visual learners. We're visual entertainers, and our sight is the thing that takes us down these dark alleys into places where we shouldn't go. And if we used our ears and our other senses and our heart more, we would not go down those tracks. But our sight takes us down dark alleys.
I believe we're too quick today to listen to the message, and solely the message that the world throws at us, more than the message of God himself. The creature doesn't know how to live because it fails to go back to the Creator.
Yep.
It's too busy looking at the created.
Yeah, I think one of the things that brings men unstuck is failure, because in the early phase of life, we don't know that failure is actually a teacher and not something that destroys us.
Really good. Really good.
As men, we need to learn to listen to our lust. Sometimes it has a lot to teach us about good desire, healthy desire, but it also teaches us about some of our disordered desires and the brokenness and the things that need healing. Why is this important? Well, it's important because quite often we are doing things to medicate the pain away. So rather than addressing the symptom, we should be addressing the cause. For a lot of guys, we sort of fight temptation militantly. We try to conquer our desires. But the truth is, we need to sometimes learn to see where that is coming from. We need to see the source of the problem and address the source rather than the symptom.
I think gaining understanding of my husband's background was really key as well. Understanding he'd been abandoned by his own father. He'd been brought up with a stepfather who was physically and verbally abusive. His mother had a mental illness, which meant she was unable to care for him. So he was very alone, very neglected, and he was in a new country that he didn't know the language. He had absolutely no support, no one to comfort him, no one to reassure him. And so turning to sexual comfort of masturbation when he was a young boy, and then having pornography magazines pretty much handed to him as he grew older, it really helped me to understand how this became his comfort. This is the thing that helped him to cope with all the pain and neglect in his life.
Talk to me about alcoholism, alcohol and porn, and the dynamic there, and how it maybe is easier to identify someone that struggles with alcohol than it is someone who struggles with porn.
Well, both addiction. I mean, they're all very similar as far as addictions go. The combination of the two is pretty devastating, though, and why it can be so destructive, pornography, and it all got wound up with an alcohol addiction as well. But I got to a point where I didn't want to be alive. The shame got to a point where I just felt so worthless.
Wow.
And I was genuinely suicidal. So I feel it's easier to talk about alcohol, to be an alcoholic or an alcohol addiction. And I'm not exactly sure. I think there's more shame that comes with sexual sin for me, especially growing up in the church. Now, whether I was told it or not, I got this sense that sex was I just felt so much shame because of that.
I remember the morning of my wedding day vividly. I remember going for prayer and standing in this dry creek bed, a little bit similar to this empty dam. And I remember praying a prayer that I'd never prayed before. I prayed, Lord, thank you for all the challenges I've had in my life in the area of sex and relationships. Thank you for my struggles, thank you for my temptations, and thank you for my stuff-ups. Now, this is not a prayer I'd prayed before, because so often I prayed that the Lord would take my desire away. But on this particular day, with the grace of knowing that I was about to enter into the covenant of marriage, I had a clarity of mind. I found myself reflecting on Romans 12, and I realised that the Lord had allowed me to make a living sacrifice of my body, that the Lord had allowed me to experience a renewing of my mind, a transformation of my mind. I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to go through that, and I still get to go through the renewing of my mind as I express marital faithfulness with my wife. I still get to depend on Jesus and rely on the grace of Jesus to keep me strong in those moments of temptation. And I'm so glad that I went through those struggles because they pointed me towards how I'm created to be. My desires, that wasn't something for me to pray to be taken away, because desires are very, very good. In fact, they point us towards a union with another. They point us towards how we're created to be as human beings, for union with God. And so there on my wedding day, I was very, very glad that God had not taken my desire away. In fact, I was experiencing an immense desire, but it was desire for union, not of use.
One time I was out with a group of mates and there was this guy who I saw across the room that kept looking at me. But I noticed that the way he looked at me wasn't like the other guy friends that I was with and that I have. I remember him coming up to me and to my group, and he tried taking my hand and twirling me around to dance with me, but I wasn't interested. And so I walked away and said, I'm just gonna go get a glass of water. And I remember just standing in that line, trying to wait for a glass of water, and I could just see from the corner of my eye him standing next to me and just looking at me up and down. It made me feel really disgusted knowing that he was right there looking at me like that. It made me feel like I didn't have much value or much worth. I wish guys would just look me in the eyes and see me and see that I am a person, I am a woman, I am a friend.
So desire. Every man wants to be wanted. Every man wants to be wanted. The most dangerous thing for a married man is for another woman to want him.
God has created all of our desires, and Satan can only twist what's good. He can create nothing. So in a sense, even in our most depraved act, in somewhere that we are looking for our dignity in that. And certainly I know that I hold on to that, and I get other men to hold on to the fact. That's why we don't need to be ashamed of being vulnerable. It's saying, look, this is what I've done, this is what I should have done. I am actually looking for my dignity. It's putting those things into context and getting a balance there.
Yeah. One of the things I've taken a lot from is that beloved son concept, but then growing into that, how the young boy needs to have his adventures celebrated. And I got 3 boys under 8, and there's a lot of casual adventure in our family. And those little victories, and I got to get excited about stuff I know nothing about. I really don't know about the Pokemon cards and which one's more powerful than another, but my 3-year-old does, right? And so learning to affirm those little casual victories, I think, is teaching them that they're important and what they are doing is important, and they're more likely to keep coming to me seeking that validation, and that'll lead to more of a epic adventure later on. And so I think it's just celebrating small desires in each of us and honouring that and engaging in it and getting curious with each other.
Our heart is good. The desires of our heart is good, and it should be affirmed in the little things and in the big things. And even when it's distorted, if we get back to what we really desire, it is good and it is godly. The topic of triggers is important to every man. Why? because learning our particular triggers can help us when we're experiencing a potential risky path that you might go on. They're different for everyone. Let's start with some internal triggers. These are triggers that come up inside of you. They're often feelings and emotions. An important acronym to remember here is the acronym BLAST. B stands for being bored. L, loneliness. A, anger. S, stressed. And T, tired. So often for many men, when they encounter one of these things, it can be the thing that trips them up or leads them down that cascading effect of unwanted sexual behaviour. It can be other things like anxiety or loneliness or something that is sort of repressed from your past or a feeling or a need that wells up inside of you. Then, of course, above all this is just basically the sexual desire. I was at this one particular talk where I listed like 1,000 different triggers, and this one guy puts up his hand and he says, "Hey, Paul, could it be that I'm just horny?" And I had to laugh because the bottom line is that we all have a God-given sexual urge, and this is a good thing to be affirmed, and it's not something to repress. But it is something that we need to learn to recognise and also not allow to drive us down those unhealthy pathways.
But if I've had men just come out of the blue for no reason and just dump, where they are sexually and all their sexual problems, immediately there's this thing in a woman that just goes, whoa, and you begin to withdraw because it's unsafe, it's inappropriate, and why are you telling me this? Do you want something sexual? Why are you dumping all this on me? So you've got to be careful and metered about your response. Talk to your brothers first, get it out of your system and introduce it gently,
It's important for every man to understand the concept of external triggers as well. These are things that happen outside of our body. It's different for every man. You're not particular or peculiar just because you have something that sort of trips you up or leads you thinking about sexual things or starts you going down the pathway towards perhaps pornography. It can be something as simple as a billboard or a person jogging along the street. It could be certain environments, going to the gym or going to a shopping centre that triggers those feelings inside of you. It can be what someone's wearing. It can be certain body types. It can be certain body postures or movements. Technology is a huge one. It can be even just pulling out your phone or opening a laptop or particular websites or social media sites. These can all be triggers. For me, what I discovered is one of my triggers was being alone. This all developed as a young boy that when I was alone at home, I would go and look at pornography. And I have this one particular memory of coming home on the school bus and realising that no one was going to be home. And my heart started to beat like shoes in a clothes dryer. Boom, 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 boom. I look back now and I realise that was a physiological response to the trigger of an anticipation of being alone and looking at pornography.
This is where brotherhood's important because we need to affirm each other. Jesus gets affirmed twice, we see in the Gospels, just before he starts his healing ministry, which is there in the River Jordan, but also a second time there on top of Mount Tabor before he descends and he heads towards Jerusalem itself. Now, Jesus knew who he was, but if the Father's voice is there affirming him and he knows himself and his followers know who he is, we too need to be affirmers of one another.
Yeah. Francis de Sales once said, "Let the enemy rage at the gate. Let him knock, pound, scream, howl. Let him do his worst. We know for certain that he cannot enter our soul, but by the door of consent." Even Jesus was tempted. In the desert, he quoted scripture at Satan. As men, temptation has a role. It has a place. But we must learn to lean on God's grace and to lean on God's word in the moment of temptation.
There's some men that may still think that, looking at a woman is cheating on their wives, right? So some men in recovery, they will just avoid looking at women. You feel dismissed. And I think, temptation is it's everywhere. It's in shopping centers, in lingerie shops. And I know you guys, it's so hard for you. But at the same time, what I would encourage you to do is to look at women in the eyes and look at their soul and their heart and try to forget everything around them. Look at women in the eyes because this doesn't matter how they're dressed. And it's the heart, and God has made us, men and women, equal, and we need respect and support. And I just encourage the men, regardless and despite of all these temptations of porn outside, to look at women with your eyes fixed in their eyes and see them with the love of God. That's all.
It's important for us to remember the words from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, which speaks about how what you're experiencing is common to men. You won't be tempted beyond your capacity. The journey of 1,000,000 miles begins with one step. For a lot of guys, the initial step or the first step in fighting sexual temptation is learning to bounce our eyes. This is something that was first described, I believe, by Arterburn and Stoker in the book Every Man's Battle. And basically it means you recognize a temptation or a particular trigger for you and you turn your eyes away straight away. The other thing that is super important is to learn to pray and to quote scripture in the moment of temptation. As soon as you see something, you can invoke a prayer and it can change that pathway straight away. It's important for us to remember that in 2 Corinthians 10, it speaks of how we have spiritual weapons, and these weapons can help us break spiritual strongholds. Well, thank you, friends, for joining me on this episode. We've covered a lot of territory, but I think if there's one key takeaway from today, it's to understand and know your triggers. It's always important, of course, for us to remind ourselves that we are greatly loved by God. We are forgiven, and ultimately, we are created for Him. I look forward to seeing you next week on Real Men.
A lot of talk in our church today about the new evangelization, and we might ask, well, what's new about the new evangelization? One thing that's new is that we're trying to renew the faith in people who should already be Catholic, should already be Christian. Individuals, families, communities, whole cultures that need to rediscover the gospel. And so what's new is that they're getting a new shot in the arm of faith, of evangelization. Another thing that's new about it is the way that we do that. And the new media and groups like Shalom World TV are very important for bringing the gospel anew to our cultures, to our families, to each of us individually. And so I encourage all the viewers of Shalom World TV, and I encourage Shalom World TV themselves to keep up the good work, to keep watching this channel and to keep up the good work of presenting the Catholic faith to our world today.